When Jack Craven was only 6 years old, he would say the following to his mother: "God made a mistake when he made me. Why can't I just die?" His mother, Laurie Craven, was shocked that children can even think such things at this age. "Can you imagine your child saying that?" she says. By the age of 12, Jack was diagnosed with sensory processing disorder. The condition is not yet fully recognized by some doctors, but according to estimates by others who do, sensory problems affect between 5 and 16% of us. They can manifest as oversensitivity to physical, emotional, or social stimuli in some people, but for others, a gentle touch can feel like a paper cut tearing through their skin. Babies might cry and remain restless unless held firmly with their backs fully straight. Such sensory challenges can make normal life the way many of us know it virtually not possible. Loud public noise would be a torture for Jack when he was a toddler. The environment at school would also be difficult for him. He would feel overwhelmed and not perform well. He would be called stupid and a dummy. Eventually, Laurie decides to school him at home. In everything they do, she says, Jack's sensitivities need to be considered. But it is not all negative. Some people with SPD report a flip side to their highly sensitive nature. Apart from being more sensitive to physical stimuli, they are also more receptive to the emotions of the people around them. This aroused the curiosity of researchers. Is sensory processing behind the personality type commonly described as sensitive? Sensitivity developed as an evolutionary advantage. So could people with CPD be at the extreme end of the sensitivity range? How are you feeling in this room right now? Horrible. This is a terrible room. I'm trying not to focus on the light. I'm trying not to listen to that echo because I'm hearing my voice in my throat and in the air and bouncing off the walls. This is the description of a blunt ante-room Rachel Schneider gives in an interview. If being here is so discomforting, the flight from New York, where she lives, must have been a torture. She nods. In 2010, Rachel was diagnosed with SPD at the age of 27. For her, SPD translates to high sensitivity to visual and auditory sensations. A flash in the face and the sound of someone chewing or clicking their pen can be unpleasant for most, but to Rachel, even just a glow can feel like a flashlight, and an echo can grab her attention like a clicking pen. She also has difficulties with a not so widely known sense, called proprioception, sometimes called the sixth sense. The body's ability to sense its location in space. She believes that this is why she likes to have weight on top of her body, like a heavy blanket. SPD was first described by occupational therapist Anna Jane Ayres in the 1960s. The unique characteristic of people with SPD is that while their sensory organs function as normal, the signals from these organs relayed to their brains are not processed appropriately. The senses of SPD patients can be under-responsive, in which case they seek stimulation, or over-responsive. In some cases, a person can be under-responsive in one sense, but over-responsive in another. One of Ayres' students, Lucy Jane Miller, has been studying SPD for over 35 years. She created assessment scales for diagnosis and took part in the research of therapy options. She is now spreading awareness of SPD and trying to get SPD recognized in the Bible of Psychiatrists and Psychologists, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. After giving a presentation on sensory processing issues in 2007, Miller was approached by Elisa Marco, who was planning a brain imaging study of children with autism. Marco then came up with the idea to also include children with SPD in her investigation, and Miller helped her to receive funding for these experiments. This critical research was about to change the life of people living with SPD. For the first time in my entire existence, there was proof that I am different. The study was published in 2013 and compared the brains of children with SPD against typically developing children using magnetic resonance imaging or MRI. The researchers were able to record differences in white matter structure, specifically in regions responsible for the processing of visual, auditory, and touch perception. A bigger follow-up paper published in 2016 also saw a correlation between the altered white matter structure and children's ability to process sound and touch input. In 2014, another paper compared kids with SPD with kids with autism, as the two conditions were known to overlap in certain areas. It was previously estimated that 90% of people with autism also suffer from sensory processing issues, but this study confirmed that SPD can also occur in the absence of autism. They provided direct evidence that the brains of the two groups are structurally different. Both the SPD and the autism groups showed impaired signaling in the brain regions involved in the processing of sensory information, but only children with autism also showed impaired signaling in the regions responsible for recognizing emotions. These results were groundbreaking because back in 2012, the American Academy of Pediatrics made the following statement. It's unclear whether children with sensory-based problems have an actual disorder related to the sensory pathways of the brain, or whether these problems are due to an underlying developmental disorder, such as anxiety, autism, or ADHD. These studies demonstrated to people with SPD that what they are experiencing is real. Rachel found it difficult to cope with her symptoms her whole life. She would find it hard to fit in as a child because social gatherings would be overwhelming and she would have to deal with panic attacks in the street. It wasn't until she was 27 when she first heard about SPD, only to find out that it's not yet well understood or fully recognized. Even after Marco's pivotal results, many pediatricians remained resistant to the idea of SPD. Thomas Boyce, a professor of pediatrics, is cautious but does not dismiss the idea that a disorder like SPD might exist. He believes we just don't know enough about it yet. Sensory sensitivities seem to be even more common in children. Between 5 and 14% of children in a US school met the screening criteria for SPD based on the survey responses of their parents, while another study reported that 16% of children are over-responsive to a type of sensory stimulus. Lori Craven took her son Jack to see Marco in San Francisco. The hotel they stayed at was in a rough area, and whenever they would walk out, Marco would grab her hand tight and start shaking because he was terrified. He'd say, "I don't like San Francisco, there are too many sad people." We get a lot of information about the environment we're in thanks to our senses. This includes the people around us. Even when we're not talking, we're expressing our emotional state through our body language, facial expressions, and the tone of our voice. These visual and auditory clues are perceived by our brains immediately, without us having to actively do anything. But being aware of the emotions of the people around us also affects our own emotions. A study at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences in Leipzig, Germany, found that the levels of the stress hormone cortisol increased in 1 in 4 of the participants if they observed someone else going through a stressful experience. This phenomenon of subconsciously adopting the emotional state of another person is called emotional contagion. Having in mind that most people already experience emotional contagion, it is not surprising that for people with enhanced sensory sensitivities, these auditory and visual clues from a person in distress will evoke an even stronger emotional response. Rachel Schneider says, "Someone can walk into a room and right away I'll know how they're feeling and how I'm going to feel around them." So people with over-responsive SPD seem to sit on the extreme end of a scale of general sensitivity to their environment that includes other people. What does being sensitive mean exactly? The average person might respond to this question with something like, someone who's easily offended, cries easily during sad or even happy movies, and would rather hang out with a friend or read a book than go to a party. Even though these things can certainly be true for some sensitive people, psychologists would define sensitive person in a somewhat different way. For psychologist Elaine Aron, being sensitive means that you process information more deeply and thoroughly. The things that people notice about some of them are the surface behaviors, like being upset by too much noise, or crying easily, or not liking to be rushed on a decision. But underneath that, there is a depth of processing. Aaron has done pioneering research on the highly sensitive person, which according to her is a distinct personality type characterized by the term sensory processing sensitivity, and found not only in humans, but also in more than 100 animal species. Being highly sensitive is different than being introverted, as almost 1/3 of the participants are actually extrovert. Having this in mind, highly sensitive people and animals are still more cautious during social interactions. They would pause and reflect instead of rushing in, meaning that they are more aware of their environment and can potentially use this as an advantage to survive. Aaron's personality questionnaire used to check if you're highly sensitive includes statements like, "I make a point to avoid violent movies and TV shows. I find myself needing to withdraw during busy days into bed or any place where I can feel some privacy and relief from stimulation. I am particularly sensitive to the effects of caffeine. I will link the checklist in the description below if you want to test yourself, but please remember that the result can only serve as a general guide and can't determine if you certainly are highly sensitive or not. Being highly sensitive also does not mean that you have a mental illness. It's simply a personality trait that's associated with increased responsiveness to both positive and negative influences. Aaron herself says I should probably take every single statement from the list. It was actually her therapist calling her sensitive back in the 90s that aroused her curiosity about what the word really means. Research estimates that only 1 in 5 are highly sensitive, and across the people who are highly sensitive, there's also a gradient of sensitivity. 80% of the population is simply not sensitive and does not fall anywhere in this gradient. Being sensitive or not can have as big of an impact in your life as gender, according to Aaron. For example, highly sensitive people tend to avoid many situations and settings that would feel overwhelming for them, or they can feel rattled when they have to do a lot within a tight time frame. Thomas Boyce also created a similar classification by splitting children into 2 groups. The first group he calls dandelions, who will act the same way pretty much everywhere, as long as the conditions are not extreme. The second group is called orchids and is highly dependent on their environment. If it's harsh, they do badly, but interestingly they do even better than dandelions in supportive environments. Both Aaron and Marco admire this work. What Aaron defines as a highly sensitive adult is very close to what we see in orchid children. Aaron and Boyce think that if there are different psychological types in one population, that is an evolutionary benefit. The highly sensitive will do better in situations where paying close attention to your surroundings is important, while the brave, adventure lovers will thrive under different conditions. This pattern can also be observed in nature, as different animals from birds to fish were also found to be over or under-sensitive. When it comes to people with SPD, Marco believes that her over-responsive patients fall on the extreme end of the orchid spectrum. But Aaron is not entirely sure. In her eyes, people with SPD are not quite the same as orchids, because oversensitive people tend to be distracted by sensory stimulation, rather than using it to learn more about their environment. What happens after someone is diagnosed with SPD is that different treatment strategies are evaluated to best suit their symptoms. This does not involve trying to numb the sensitivity, but focuses on making it less traumatic instead. Quick physical exercises like jumping and push-ups or using a skin brush over her skin can have a calming effect for Rachel Schneider. There are no drugs developed specifically for SPD just yet, but people with SPD are sometimes prescribed ADHD or anxiety medications. In 2017, a new digital medicine used to train attention was suggested, namely Project Evo. A study investigated the effects of the video game on children and adolescents diagnosed with the ADHD, and excitingly, it did seem to work. The sustained attention of the patients was significantly improved when compared to a control group. The research team followed up with the subset of patients who also met the criteria for SPD to check if the initial benefits were retained. The subgroup continued to show a decrease in inattention both 9 months and 3 years after the original Project Evo training. More than half of the participants no longer met the criteria for ADHD 3 years later. Jack Craven was one of the participants, and his mother Laurie noticed that visual input was not as challenging for him anymore. Marco is also looking into the genes associated with SPD and how these compare to autism and ADHD. The overlap across these conditions comes from the fact that they can all result in similar symptoms. A child with SPD who finds it difficult to concentrate at school because she gets distracted by the sound the marker makes when the teacher is writing on the board might be diagnosed with ADHD. Because a child who is craving proprioceptive input or input about the position of his body in space might keep running around, he might be labeled as hyperactive. Even the genetics for these neurological conditions overlap, so the labels are actually just meant to describe the different behaviors involved. Rachel Schneider is now an advocate for SPD and is a point of contact for fellow sufferers. She finds it crucial for SPD to be recognized as a distinct disorder so that fewer people grow up not understanding what's wrong with them and feeling dismissed. As from Florida, now 27, has also been living with SPD. The lights at school would sometimes be painful for him, but he thought it sounds weird, so he'd say he has a headache instead. His parents and teachers ended up thinking he was just trying to skip class. He only found the courage to tell his mom about his everyday struggles at the age of 21. His mom responded, Sean, that sounds like a crazy person. She told me she deserves a better son than me. Stories like this are not rare, and are the reason why Rachel Schneider and Kelly Jureko decided to launch the Sensory is Real initiative in 2016. With the people of the sensory community, they agree that sensory issues exist and are worthy of your attention, understanding, and acceptance. Because little is known about SPD, many are left looking for an explanation for their sensory challenges for years, and often develop secondary anxiety. Finally, receiving a diagnosis can be life-changing, because you can validate what you've been experiencing and receive support, but there is still a long way to go in the research of SPD. While sensory processing challenges are now widely recognized in children with autism, the children who do not meet the criteria for autism diagnosis but still experience such sensory processing differences are virtually unstudied.